As we were thinking about what it means to depict a leaderful community and how we were going to talk about this fall with this seasonal leadership team and with the rest of the staff, we looked at our resources and we're thankful for people like Natasha and all of you. We are a community, thankfully, that has a whole lot of folks with talents and gifts who can serve. And so it's easy to think about those leaders. We're also blessed to have people like Letiah Fraser, who is one of our residents here this year, working with the Open Table, and we're blessed to have her at Second as well. Letiah is a ordained pastor. She is actually currently studying to receive her doctorate, which she will get hopefully next year at some point, that focuses on spiritual formation and disability theology. Letiah was very involved in and continues to remain tangentially involved in the Poor People's Campaign in Kansas City. And that's one of those organizations that doesn't really have one figurehead. It is an organization that has said, we want to be a leader-full community. And so when we thought about this series and we recognized we had Letiah, we said, Letiah, would you be willing to share with us your experience? And she thankfully said that she would. And so I am honored and thankful that we have Reverend Letiah Fraser with us this morning to share her understanding of and experience of being part of a leaderful church. Letiah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, everyone. Hi, good morning. I'm so thankful for the gift of technology that enables us all to gather during this unique year, the event known as 2020. I'm also thankful for the gift of the 1001 new worshiping communities that allows me to learn and dream about how I may contribute my voice, body, and life to a world in which God is already at work for the good of humanity and all of creation. Let us pray. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of us gathered on this sacred space, virtual sacred space, be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So I grew up in a church tradition in which the pastor and the congregation preached the sermon together. I heard many voices on a Sunday morning. Usually, my pastor would begin by reciting the first part of Psalm 122, verse 1, usually in the King James Version. I was glad when they said unto me. Then the congregation would respond in unison by completing the verse, let us go into the house of the Lord. I will not ask you to do that this morning, but I would like us to engage a little bit in a little bit of a call and response. I will ask 6 questions throughout the sermon, and I will invite you all to respond, and then Paul will share just a few. So here's the first question. Who are some local or national people or groups that come to mind when you think of leadership? Would you just take a few moments to respond in the chat? Who are some local people or groups that come to mind when you think of leadership?
The Women's March.
It's a good one.
Martin Luther King Jr., Alvin Brooks.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. Keep sharing in the chat. When I think about leadership, I think about movements. As a person who lives with a physical disability, the first movement that comes to mind is the disability rights movement that began in the late 60s and got its inspiration from the civil rights movement. Although the leaders of this movement are not what would be typical leaders, leaders like Ed Roberts, who is the father of the independent living movement, who contracted polio when he was 14 or 15, and people told him that he wouldn't go to college, and he didn't take that as a response. So he applied to the University of California in Berkeley and figured out a way to go, which inspired many others with disabilities to follow his lead. and they created what was called the Rolling Quads, which was a group of students who advocated for change on campus and in the community for people with disabilities. I think about people like Justin Dart, who is the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the landmark legislation for people with disabilities in this country. I think about people like Judy Heumann, who continues to, but for her whole life, fights for equal education opportunities for people with disabilities in the legislature. So when I think about leaderful movements, I think about the disability rights movement. I feel like that's a movement that goes hand in hand with our discussion about leaderful leadership. Leadership that is leaderful centers the bodies, voices, and experiences of the poor and dispossessed. Those of us who are poor and dispossessed expand the realized imagination of who is in leadership and what leadership looks like. Acts of leadership can be taken with our bodies. Leaders can use their voice without speaking, and leadership can simply be experienced. Leadership that is leaderful is inclusive of all bodies and experiences. So here's question 2. Where do people go, or what methods do people use when they're looking to fill a leadership position? Would you take a few moments to respond in the chat?
So I wrote elections, Letiah.
Yes, elections.
Yeah.
Sure.
Contests.
Yes.
What else? What are other ways? Nepotism, social media, word of mouth.
Yeah. Those are all good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The disability rights movement is just one movement I think of when I think about leaderful leadership. Jesus, along with the disciples, spirit-led movement to spread the good news and to liberate those experiencing oppression is another example we can learn from. Jesus used unlikely methods to fill leadership positions. Jesus found leaders while they were fishing, collecting taxes, and often in stigmatized communities. Allow me to read John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15, so that we can get a peek at a community of people who are poor and dispossessed with whom Jesus and the disciples interacted. After this, there was a Jewish festival, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, near the sheep gate in the north city wall, is a pool with the Aramaic name Bethsaida. It had 5 covered porches, and a crowd of people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed sat there. A certain man who was there had been sick 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, knowing that he had already been there a long time, he asked, "Do you want to get well?" The man answered him, "Sir, I don't have anyone who can put me in the water when it is stirred up. When I am trying to get in, someone else has gotten in ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man was well, and he picked up his mat and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. The Jewish leader said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. You aren't allowed to carry your mat." He answered, "The man who made me well said, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" They inquired, "Who is this man who said, 'Pick up your mat and walk'?" The man who had been cured didn't know who it was, but because Jesus had slipped away from the crowd gathered there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said, "See, you have been made well. Don't sin anymore in case anything worse happens to you." The man went and proclaimed to the Jewish leaders that Jesus was the man who had made him well. In this biblical narrative that we just read together, Jesus looks for leaders in places he shouldn't go. While in Jerusalem for a Jewish festival, Jesus visits a community of people he knew would not be at the festival. Jesus visits a community who had been stigmatized by their wider culture because they were part of a community of people who lived with disabilities. People with disabilities lived in the shadow of society and were not allowed to participate in the religious, social, or economic life of the society because they were considered unclean. And everyone avoided that stigma like the plague. Jesus, however, visited the community of those who lived with physical, visual, hearing, and a variety of other disabilities. Jesus organized a leaderful movement that lifted up the voices of the poor and dispossessed. Leadership that is leaderful is inclusive of all bodies, voices, and experiences. The Black Lives Matter movement, or hashtag Black Lives Matter, was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter is a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. By combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy, they are winning immediate improvements in Black lives. Leadership that is leaderful notices and learns the stories of local people who are being ignored. The biblical narrative tells us that Jesus saw a certain man who was a part of a specific disability community for 38 years. Jesus saw him and Jesus knew his story. We are only given limited information about this man. We are left to wonder what Jesus knew. Was he born into this community? Did he acquire his disability and therefore wasn't always a part of this community? We don't know. What we do know is that Jesus took the time to notice him and learn his story. Jesus understood that leadership that is leaderful notices and learns the stories of local people who are being ignored. So here's question 3. Whose bodies, voices, and experiences are not represented in church leadership, on the church committees in Heartland Presbytery? Take a few moments to respond in the chat.
The youth.
Yeah, it's good.
Who else's voices aren't represented experiences in church leadership typically? The poor.
The poor.
Those we serve, people of color, people with mental illness.
Those are all good, thank you. Keep them coming. Leadership that is leaderful notices and learns the stories of local people who are being ignored. Leadership that is leaderful centers the bodies, voices, and experiences of the poor and dispossessed. Yet another movement comes to mind, the original 1967-68 Poor People's Campaign. Martin Luther King Jr. announced the Poor People's Campaign at a staff retreat for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in November of 1967. King planned for an initial group of 2,000 poor people to descend on Washington, D.C., southern states and northern cities to meet with government officials to demand jobs, unemployment insurance, a fair minimum wage, and education for poor adults and children, designed to bolster the self-esteem and self-image. The Poor People's Campaign was seen by King as the next chapter in the struggle for genuine equality. King believed that African Americans and other minorities would never enter full citizenship until they had economic security. Through nonviolent action, King and the SCLC hoped to focus the nation's attention on economic inequality and poverty. Dr. King would be assassinated before this dream would come to be in 1968. The idea of a poor people's campaign emerged when Dr. King began to ask transformative questions in his speech, "Where do we go from here?" King said, "There are 40 million poor people, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America?" And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more, we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggar in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means questions must be raised. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you must begin to ask the questions, who owns the oil? We begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? These are words that must be said. Leadership that is leaderful asks transformative questions. In this healing encounter, Jesus asked the man who had a disability for 38 years a transformative question. Jesus asked the man, "Do you want to get well?" It is more than a question about being able to walk. Jesus was questioning a society that would create structures that would exclude people with disabilities. It was a question that perhaps caused the man to ponder whether he wanted a better life for himself and the disability community in which he was a part. It was a question about healing, but more than that, it was a question about liberation. The man responded to Jesus by retelling a story that perhaps he had been handed down, or perhaps if he had come as an adult, this was a story that he had been told, something about an angel stirring the waters and needing to be the first one to enter the pool to be healed. This was just an older version of the poverty is your fault, you've got to work hard enough to get out of it myth. I'm not even sure the man believed the story he was telling Jesus, but it was a story that had become part of the community culture. Jesus understood that leadership that is leaderful asks transformative questions. So here's question number 4. What transformative questions are we asking about our communities, country, and world? What stories have we believed about people or communities because of what we have been handed down? Or because it has simply become part of the narrative of the larger culture? Take a few moments to respond in the chat. What transformative questions are we asking? What stories have we been handed down?
How can policing be better?
That's a good one.
What systems don't work for all?
I like that one too.
What does freedom mean? What systems need to be dismantled? How do we move to a sustainable future?
I like it. Keep them coming in the chat. Leadership that is leaderful centers the body's voices and experiences of the poor and dispossessed. So here's one last movement that came to mind today. In 2018, the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II, a Disciples of Christ pastor from the South, and the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, a PCUSA pastor from the East Coast, joined forces with faith leaders, organizers, and people of moral conscience from more than 40 states to bring Dr. King's vision into the 21st century. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is a movement that seeks to peacefully combat the evils of systemic poverty, systemic racism, militarism, ecological devastation, and a distorted moral narrative of Christian nationalism that pervades our world, country, communities, churches, and homes. Leaders organize their local communities in several different ways, including engaging in political education, projects of survival, marches, legislative involvement, and acts of nonviolence, civil disobedience. Leadership that is leaderful breaks unjust laws. Yes, leadership that is leaderful breaks unjust laws. Jesus responds to the distorted narrative that the man believed about himself and his community by breaking an unjust law. This created a way toward liberation for the man with a physical disability. It was against the law for Jesus to heal on the Sabbath, and yet Jesus did it anyway. The physical liberation of the man and perhaps the whole community in which he was a part was more important than obeying an unjust law. Jesus understood that leadership that is leaderful breaks unjust laws. So here's question number 5. What organizations in your community are fighting in nonviolent ways against unjust laws? What are ways that you or the church could join others who are doing the work of liberating those who are being impacted by unjust laws and policies? Take a few moments and respond in the chat.
What organizations in your community are fighting in nonviolent ways against unjust laws? And someone says Second Pres is.
All right.
Stand Up KC.
Yes.
KC Tenants. Surge. Fight for 15.
I like it. Keep them coming. Leadership that is leaderful centers the bodies, voices, and experiences of the poor and dispossessed. During Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus often created spaces for people who had been ignored to publicly tell the truth to their communities about the ways in which they had been excluded from them and the ways in which that they were now experiencing liberation. The woman caught in adultery, the Samaritan woman, and the woman with the bleeding problem are people and their stories that come to mind. Leadership that is leaderful creates brave spaces for those who are poor and dispossessed to publicly tell the truth. When the man who was formerly paralyzed experienced liberation, he told the truth publicly, specifically to the religious leaders, to those who made up the power structure of his society. Because Jesus created a brave space for the man to publicly tell the truth, the man experienced healing. Jesus understood that leadership that is leaderful creates brave spaces for those who are poor and dispossessed to tell the truth. Here's our last question. What are some ways that you have or you could create spaces at the church or in your personal lives? What are some ways or spaces, brave spaces, that you can create in your church or in your personal life? Feel free to share in the chat.
You know, Letiah, I'll just say that I'm thankful to have somebody like you as a senior pastor of a typically a church that looks a lot like me. I'm thankful to even have the opportunity to turn to other leaders, and I just want to again thank you for your leadership and your voice, and I'm glad that that you could fill our space this morning with your prophetic words.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Social media,
Yeah.
Church Women United.
Yes.
Little free libraries.
I love those.
Yeah.
I love those libraries. Thanks so much. Keep sharing in the chat. Leadership that is leaderful creates brave spaces for those who are poor and dispossessed to publicly tell the truth. Leadership that is leaderful centers the bodies, voices, and experiences of the poor and dispossessed. So, as a response, I want to invite us into an imaginative meditation. So, I will invite you for just a few moments, if it feels comfortable to you, to close your eyes and invite God to awaken your imagination. What would our world be like if leadership spaces in our country, community, and world were inclusive of all bodies, voices, and experiences? Put your hands over your ears for just a moment and imagine yourself taking the time to listen to the story of someone in your community. With your eyes closed and ears covered, use your imagination to really notice and hear the story of that person in your community who is often ignored. Now, with your eyes still closed, move one of the hands that you have over your ears and place it over your mouth. Imagine yourself asking transformative questions about the systems in your community that are set up to make people poor and dispossessed. Next, keep one hand placed over your mouth and move the other hand that is placed over your ear to your forehead. Think about the organizations in your community that are fighting against the oppression caused by unjust laws. In what ways do you imagine yourself partnering with them? Lastly, I invite you to open your eyes and focus on your hands. Consider for a moment what brave spaces that you are creating for those who are poor and dispossessed to publicly tell the truth. May what we've imagined be realized in our communities and worlds with the help of the Spirit. May it be so.